Hello, everyone. My name is Manesh Girn. I'm a neuroscience PhD student working over at the MNI under the supervision of Professor Nathan Spreng. My talk today is entitled LSD Flattens the Functional Hierarchy of the Brain. So some background. So what is LSD? It is a serotonergic psychedelic compound, and it elicits its main subjective effects through agonism at the 5-HT2A receptor. It can elicit a huge range of subjective effects and has recently been demonstrated to have potential in the treatment of mental health conditions. On the brain side, it can elicit significant changes to whole brain functional organization and dynamics, as evidenced by a reduction in the segregation of brain networks in terms of decreases in within network connectivity and increases in between network connectivity, and also a trend towards increased global brain connectivity, where essentially individual regions become more interconnected to the rest of the brain. On the level of dynamics, we see a greater complexity of functional connectivity states and a greater entropy of regional time series. And in the current project, the motivation comes from a recently proposed model, the Relaxed Beliefs Under Psychedelics, or REBUS model, which unified past psychological and neural findings with psychedelics into a unified framework based on predictive coding and the free energy principle. For our purposes, we're interested in one of the primary hypotheses from this model, which was that the psychedelic state might be underpinned by a reduction in the differentiation of low-level sensory processing from high-level cognitive processing. However, this hypothesis has yet to be directly empirically tested. Interestingly, independent of psychedelic research, a recent cortical gradient mapping technique, which characterizes cortical organization in terms of continuous gradients, revealed a hierarchical gradient from unimodal to transmodal cortex. And this used a diffusion map embedding algorithm, which is essentially a nonlinear dimensionality reduction technique from the family of graph Laplacians. And so for this project, I applied this a novel approach to cortical organization to characterize unimodal, transmodal, hierarchical differentiation in the LSD state. So I used a previously published data set, published in PNAS back in 2016. And the data I used consists of 2 7-minute resting state scans from 15 subjects for each of LSD and placebo conditions. So results, we confirmed our primary hypothesis. There was a reduction in the hierarchical differentiation in the LSD state relative to placebo. And let me walk you through this figure. So first, the hierarchical gradient is present here, and it goes, as you can see, on the negative side from somatomotor, auditory, and visual areas to the positive side, which is association areas within the midline, a part of the default mode network, also areas of the lateral parietal cortex, lateral temporal, and areas of the superior and middle frontal gyrus. If you look at the histogram, you see blue is LSD, gray is placebo. There's this contraction on both sides, indicative of a smaller range, which again suggests reduced differentiation along this axis. Looking at it quantitatively, you see there is a significant reduction in the range or span of the gradient in the LSD state. Looking at vertex-wise and networks-wise comparisons, the largest differences are in somatosensory areas, increases in somatosensory areas, and decreases in the posterior cingulate, precuneus, and parts of the superior frontal gyrus, which essentially are part of the default mode network and frontal control network. So you see this kind of pattern where default network and frontal areas are becoming less positive, whereas the visual and somatomotor are becoming less negative. So it seems to be a contraction on both sides of the gradient, where unimodal and transmodal aspects are pulled towards zero. And then building on that, looking at behavioral associations, we found an association between gradient scores and ego dissolution, self-reported ego dissolution in the right medial prefrontal cortex. So ego dissolution corresponds to a dissolution of a sense of self as encompassed by both a sense of having stable bodily boundaries and also a sense of having a narrative identity. And essentially it's related to feelings of merging with the environment and other people. And this is a core aspect of the psychedelic experience as associated with therapeutic outcomes. And so we see that the hierarchical differentiation of this area of medial prefrontal cortex was significantly associated with this self-reported measure. Conclusions. So we did find that LSD reduces brain hierarchical differentiation in a manner consistent with a reduction in the functional segregation of high-level from low-level processing zones, consistent with the REBUS model I mentioned before. And also these gradient scores are significantly associated with a core aspect of the psychedelic experience. And lastly, more fundamentally, This is the first study that we know of that shows that gradients of cortical organization can be altered in a state-dependent manner that tracks ongoing experience. And with that, I want to say thank you to funding sources, also our collaborators at ICL, at the Center for Psychedelic Research, who collected this data. And as a shameless plug, if you're interested in psychedelic science, check out my YouTube channel called The Psychedelic Scientist. And with that, I want to thank you for your attention.